The dinosaurs never truly died. We just forgot what they turned into. Imagine standing alone in the tall grass of a prehistoric savanna. The ground beneath your feet begins to vibrate. Not from an earthquake, but from footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, accelerating footsteps. Three-toed talons slamming into the sun-baked dirt with the force of something that has never, in its entire evolutionary history, needed to be afraid of anything. You turn. Bearing down on you from the open plain is a 10-foot-tall bird. 500 pounds of warm-blooded theropod muscle. A skull the size of a horse's torso, armed with a solid bone hook pointed directly at your chest. And it is not slowing down. We are all taught the exact same, comforting story. 66 million years ago, a rock the size of a mountain slammed into the earth. The sky burned, the oceans boiled, the giant reptiles fell, and the mammals, small, adaptable, hiding in the dark, crawled out of the ash and inherited the planet. It is a great story. It is the foundation of modern paleontology. But it only happened on some continents. Because when the ancient supercontinent fractured, the landmass of South America broke away from the rest of the world and drifted alone across the ocean. It became something unprecedented in the history of life on this planet. A floating fortress. A massive, inescapable quarantine zone completely sealed off from the evolutionary arms race happening everywhere else on Earth. No wolves crossed that ocean. No bears. No lions. No outside predator ever reached these shores to challenge what was already growing there. On this isolated continent, the mammals did not win. They were hunted. Because in this sealed-off world, the dinosaur blueprint never stopped running. It simply grounded itself. It traded its wings for pure, heavily muscled mass. It traded its flight feathers for the sprinting legs of an Olympic athlete. And at the absolute pinnacle of this avian empire, a terrifying family known as the Phorusrhacidae stood the largest apex carnivore of its kind in Earth's history. Meet Kelenken, the ultimate terror bird. But here is the question that has haunted paleontologists for decades. If this animal was the undisputed, undefeated king of an entire continent for millions of years, what actually killed it? The answer will dismantle everything you think you know about prehistoric extinction. To understand the sheer terror of Kelenken, you only need to look at one piece of its anatomy: the skull. In the entire fossil record of avian dinosaurs, across every extinct bird species ever discovered, Kelenken holds a record that has never been broken. It possessed the largest skull of any known bird in the history of this planet. Measuring over 28 inches long, the head of this animal was roughly the size of the entire torso of a modern horse. But unlike a horse's skull, which is built for grazing and survival, this structure had one singular, non-negotiable purpose: execution. The upper jaw ended in a massive, solid bone hook that curved sharply downward. It was not tapered and delicate like a raptor's beak. It was thick, dense, and blunt. A structural weapon engineered for a single devastating movement. When a lion or a wolf makes a kill, it relies on suffocation. It bites the throat and waits. It is a slow, grueling process of sustained grip while the prey struggles. Kelenken had no patience for that equation. It operated on a completely different principle: the hatchet strike. Anchoring that massive skull was a heavily muscled neck built like a coiled industrial spring. When Kelenken closed the distance on its prey, it did not bite and hold. It threw its entire upper body forward and drove that massive, hooked skull straight downward, like a biological pickaxe swung from 10 feet in the air. The goal was not to suffocate. The goal was to shatter. Driven by 500 pounds of descending body weight, that hooked beak was designed to punch directly through a skull, or instantly sever a spinal column on the very first strike. One blow. Clean. Irreversible. For smaller prey, the fossil evidence points to something even more disturbing. Biomechanical analysis of Kelenken's neck vertebrae reveals they were heavily reinforced to withstand extreme lateral stress. Scientists call this behavior the shake and break. We can actually see a miniature version of this today. Kelenken's closest living relative is a much smaller South American bird called the sirima. When a sirima catches a lizard or a small rodent, it bites down, lifts the prey completely off the ground, and violently whips its head, beating the animal against the earth over and over until the spine snaps. Now take that identical, hardwired biological behavior and scale it up to 500 pounds and 10 feet of height. Kelenken would clamp its massive beak onto a mammal, lift it completely off the ground, and whip its head with enough force to snap the animal's spine like a dry twig, before the prey even had time to register what happened. Once the prey was dead, Kelenken didn't chew. It used its sharp talons to pin the carcass to the dirt, hooked its beak into the flesh, and ripped away massive chunks of meat, swallowing them entirely whole. It was a terrestrial guillotine, the biological siege engine. But carrying a skull the size of a horse, mounted 10 feet in the air, creates a severe physical problem. An animal this top-heavy should be clumsy. It should be slow. It should be easily outmaneuvered by lighter, more agile prey. But Kelenken hid a second biological secret. One that defied the laws of physics entirely. If you put a 10-foot-tall, top-heavy bird on an open savanna, logic dictates that the mammals should simply run. A four-legged animal using a flexible spine and 4 limbs for propulsion should easily outpace a heavy bipedal bird. But South America was an evolutionary mirror dimension, and Kelenken broke that rule completely. Beneath its massive barrel chest and useless vestigial wings were legs that had no business belonging to an animal of this size. Kelenken possessed elongated, incredibly efficient lower leg bones known as the tarso-metatarsus. They were not thick and heavily armored like a modern ostrich. They were lean, highly refined biological pistons. Computer models of Kelenken's stride mechanics and bone density suggest it could sustain running speeds that matched or exceeded a modern championship racehorse. Let that register. A 500-pound, 10-foot-tall executioner running across the flat Patagonian savanna, closing the distance on you at a pace that outstrips almost every four-legged mammal alive today. At that speed, even before the beak struck, the sheer kinetic impact of 500 pounds of bird slamming into a fleeing mammal carried the force of a car collision. Shattered ribs, catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. The blunt force trauma alone was enough to end the pursuit. There was no outrunning it. There was no outmaneuvering it on open ground. And Kelenken didn't just use this impossible speed to hunt, it used it to dominate every other predator on the continent. There were mammalian predators in South America at this time. The Sparassodonts, a bizarre family of marsupial hunters. Among them was Thylacosmilus, a terrifying predator that looked exactly like a saber-toothed cat, carrying massive, curving fangs that grew past its lower jaw. On every other continent on Earth, a saber-toothed predator sat at the absolute top of the food chain. But in South America, it hunted in the shadow of Kelenken. Picture a saber-toothed Thylacosmilus spending hours running down and killing a large herbivore in the heat. It is exhausted. It is finally feeding. And then, from across the open plain, a 10-foot silhouette appears at the edge of the grass. Kelenken didn't charge. It didn't need to. It flared its feathers, snapped its massive beak with a crack like a rifle shot, and aggressively walked forward with the unhurried certainty of something that has never lost a negotiation. The saber-tooth backed away, in its own territory, on its own kill. Because in this hemisphere, it was simply not the largest thing present. It could do nothing but watch from a distance as Kelenken stole its meal. For millions of years, the terror birds held absolute, unchallenged rule over an entire hemisphere. Every other predator paid the tax. Every open plain belonged to the bird. So, how does a perfect apex predator simply vanish from the earth? The answer is not what almost everyone believes, and what they believe is one of the most persistent, confidently repeated lies in the history of popular science. Here is what you were taught. Here is what documentaries, textbooks, and popular science channels have repeated for decades with complete confidence. Around 3 million years ago, the Panama Land Bridge formed, a narrow strip of land connecting North and South America for the first time in tens of millions of years. And when that bridge appeared, the elite mammalian predators of the North marched south. The Smilodon, the massive, heavily muscled saber-toothed cat, packs of giant dire wolves, highly evolved, lethal hunters pouring into South America's ancient ecosystem. According to this story, the terror birds were outclassed, outcompeted, hunted down, driven into extinction by the superior intelligence and pack coordination of the invading northern mammals. It is the ultimate story of mammalian triumph, the definitive victory of our class over the last remnant of the dinosaur age. And it sounds completely believable. There is just one problem. It is completely, scientifically, false. Kelenken did not die fighting a northern saber-toothed cat. It never encountered one. Not once. Not ever. Here's the timeline that popular science has been quietly ignoring. Kelenken lived 15 million years ago, during the Middle Miocene epoch. The Panama Land Bridge did not fully form until approximately 3 million years ago. That means by the time Smilodon and the dire wolves finally crossed into South America, Kelenken had already been extinct for over 12 million years. Claiming that a saber-toothed cat drove Kelenken to extinction is like claiming that a modern grey wolf hunted the Tyrannosaurus rex to death. The timelines don't just miss each other, they miss by an ocean of geological time. All of those dramatic documentary renderings of giant terror birds fighting Smilodons on the ancient pampas are built on a timeline error. Repeated so many times by so many sources that it calcified into accepted truth. The mammals did not defeat the king. The great Smilodon never had the chance to look a fully grown Kelenken in the eye. So, if no animal on Earth was capable of threatening this predator, if it ran too fast, struck too hard, and dominated too completely to be beaten in combat, what actually killed it? Kelenken was never defeated. Not once in its millions of years of dominance was there an animal on this continent with the speed to outrun it, the strength to challenge it, or the audacity to try. Its killer was not a predator, it was the ground beneath its feet. 15 million years ago, deep beneath the western edge of South America, tectonic forces were doing something that had been slowly building for millions of years. The continental plates were compressing, buckling, pushing the Earth's crust relentlessly upward along the entire western spine of the continent. The Andes Mountains were rising. As those peaks climbed higher and higher into the atmosphere, something changed in the climate of the entire continent. The massive mountain range acted as a wall, blocking the moisture-laden weather systems rolling in off the Pacific Ocean. The rain that had sustained the lush Patagonian savannas for millions of years no longer reached the eastern plains. Scientists call it the rain shadow effect. The rich grasslands began to dry, slowly at first, and then faster. The savannas cracked, bleached, the rivers narrowed. The vast, flat, prey-filled plains where Kelenken had reigned for millions of years began their slow transition into something completely unrecognizable. Arid, windswept, barren. And without the grasslands, the great herbivore herds began to collapse. Without the herbivores, the food supply that had sustained the apex carnivores simply ran out. Here is what made this a death sentence specifically for Kelenken. Running at racehorse speed requires an enormous, continuous calorie intake just to maintain the biological machinery. Smaller terrorbird species could adjust. They required less fuel, hunted smaller prey, and managed to survive for millions of years. But Kelenken was not a small machine. It was the largest avian carnivore the planet had ever produced. And you cannot run a machine that size on scraps. The metabolism that had made it invincible was now consuming it from the inside. There was no final battle, no dramatic last stand against a worthy rival. Kelenken, the undisputed, undefeated ruler of an entire hemisphere, the closest the mammal world ever came to living in Jurassic Park, simply walked the drying, dying plains of Patagonia, growing weaker with each season. The greatest bird that ever lived did not roar at the end. It did not fight. It walked out into the dust of a continent it had owned completely and did not come back. Kelenken was erased not by a predator worthy of its legacy, but by mountains that grew too tall and rain that stopped arriving. Its extinction is the most powerful proof in the fossil record that the dinosaur blueprint was never flawed. It was only geographically interrupted. When left completely alone, sealed inside its own evolutionary laboratory, undisturbed by outside competition, the Earth did not favor the mammals. It favored the birds. But while Kelenken's world was drying out above the ground, a completely different evolutionary war was waged at the edge of the prehistoric water. In the sweltering, dark tropical swamps of ancient South America, something cold-blooded, heavily armored, and armed with one of the highest bite forces in the history of the planet was waiting in the dark. Next time on Echoes of Extinction, we leave the dying plains entirely. We enter the prehistoric water, and we meet a 40-foot apex predator that grew so massive it actively hunted and crushed giant prehistoric turtles like glass. Meet Phorusrhacidae, the monster caiman. If Kelenken kept you watching until the end, hit subscribe, leave a like, and tap the video on your screen right now to continue your journey into the prehistoric dark. We will see you in the next episode of Echoes of Extinction.